There's a law that's been standing for barely 90 years against a custom that's been around for 12,000. And before you keep going, sit with that number for a second, because it's going to explain everything that comes next. Let's start with a grave. Not just any grave. A grave from almost 2,700 years ago, found under dry earth in Central Asia, with the body of a middle-aged man surrounded by musical instruments, horse harnesses, and a bundle of plant matter that, against all logic, was still recognizable after 27 centuries. It wasn't food for the afterlife. It was the plant that community considered so valuable it deserved to accompany the dead. If you can picture that scene and it sticks with you, hit like right now and subscribe, because this story is just getting started. And tell me in the comments, what do you think the people who buried him that way were feeling? That plant had been circulating for thousands of years before it reached that grave. About 12,000 years ago, somewhere in East Asia, a group of early farmers, some of the first humans to try planting instead of gathering, came across a plant that did almost everything. Its fiber could be woven and turned into rope. Its seeds could be eaten. It could be pressed into oil, and it also relieved pain. It wasn't just another crop. For that time, it was the equivalent of finding a multi-tool growing straight out of the ground. The earliest written records mentioning it appear in an ancient Chinese medical text, one of the oldest ever preserved, attributed to a legendary emperor who recommended it for joint pain and even for fevers. From there, the plant traveled. It moved along the same trade routes that carried silk and spices westward, crossing towering mountains in Central Asia. And it was right in one of those mountain passes where archaeologists found, in tombs nearly 2,500 years old, wooden braziers with burnt stones. The oldest known evidence of people gathering to inhale the smoke of this plant, deliberately, during funeral ceremonies. It wasn't just any variety. They analyzed the remains, and it turned out to be far more potent than what grew wild in the area. They had chosen it on purpose. Around those same centuries, a Greek chronicler traveling through the region wrote about a nomadic people of horsemen and archers who would pitch small tents, throw the plant on red-hot stones inside them, and breathe in whatever came out. It lets off such vapor that no Greek steam bath could surpass it, in his own words, as he described those people as delighted with the ritual. For a long time, historians thought he was exaggerating, until, almost 2,400 years later, an archaeologist excavating tombs sealed under permafrost in Siberia found exactly what the chronicler had described: tent frames, heated stones, seeds from the same plant. He hadn't made anything up. Years later, another tomb from that same people turned up, this time in a mountain range in the Caucasus, with solid gold cups that, when analyzed, had traces of that plant mixed with opium. And further still, in a nearly 2,700-year-old sanctuary excavated in the Middle East, archaeologists found two altars, one with incense, the expected offering, and the other with that same plant deliberately mixed with animal dung, a combination designed to keep the burn slow so the smoke would release in a controlled way. Whoever prepared that altar knew exactly what they were doing, and it was no coincidence that so many different cultures, without ever agreeing with one another, arrived at the same conclusion. Our own bodies naturally produce a molecule that acts on the very same receptors this plant activates, like we came factory-installed with a lock built exactly for it. That would explain why, on the other side of the continent, in the Indian subcontinent, this plant wasn't just used, it was worshipped. One of India's oldest sacred texts lists it among a handful of sacred plants, and one of Hinduism's major deities is honored as the lord of a drink made with its leaves and milk, which tradition says saved him after he swallowed a poison capable of destroying the world. That same drink is still prepared today, well into the 21st century, during festivals that have been celebrated for 3,000 years. The plant kept moving. Around the year 200 of our era, in China, a doctor mixed it with wine to operate on his patients without them feeling a thing. A century before the West came up with anything close to anesthesia. That same doctor ended up imprisoned for refusing to become the personal healer of a warlord. He preferred treating ordinary people. Before he died, he tried to hand his writings to a prison guard who was too afraid to accept them. The doctor burned his own notes. The exact formula died with him and has never been reconstructed. There's even a story that's almost hard to believe about a tribe in Central Africa that discovered this plant, and from that point on, stopped waging war. They reorganized themselves around growing it, renamed themselves the Children of Hemp, and called their land the Land of Friendship. Their everyday greeting became a single word. That meant, at the same time, hemp and life, because to them there was no difference between the two. By the time Europeans crossed the Atlantic, this plant had already been an essential crop in Europe for centuries. Its fibers rigged whole ships, wove sails, and rope. So bringing hemp cultivation to the New World wasn't a cultural statement. It was pure logistics, like bringing along wheat seeds. It spread quickly through the colonies, though farmers preferred other, more profitable crops, to the point that a colonial assembly had to pass a law forcing them, by decree, to plant it. It wasn't a suggestion. It was mandatory. For 2 more centuries, it was simply part of everyday life, until, in 1930, an official took charge of his country's first federal narcotics agency, and stayed in that post for 32 years. That official tied the plant, in his public speeches, to migrant and black communities, and claimed its use made minorities forget their place. The same man openly despised jazz music, called it satanic, and went after musicians who played it, including a singer he targeted not for using any drug, but for singing a protest song about lynching that made powerful people uncomfortable. He was the one who deliberately started using a different, more foreign-sounding name for the plant, precisely because it sounded more threatening. He put together an entire folder of unverified police reports, asked dozens of doctors what they thought. Most of them told him the plant wasn't dangerous, and ended up citing only the one who agreed with what he'd already decided beforehand. That's how the first punitive tax against its cultivation was passed in 1937. Decades later, in 1970, a new administration placed it in the most restrictive category possible, the same one as the most dangerous drugs known. One of that administration's own advisors admitted, years later, in an interview, that the real strategy had been something else. They couldn't directly criminalize war protesters or black communities, so they tied one substance to each group, made both illegal, and that got them a legal excuse to arrest whoever they wanted. That's not an interpretation. It's a direct confession from one of the architects of that policy. Almost 20 years later, an administrative law judge from that same narcotics agency spent 2 full years reviewing all the available medical evidence, and concluded in writing that the plant should never have been placed in the most dangerous category. He recommended reclassifying it. His own agency rejected the recommendation and left it exactly where it was. And that brings us back to the number we started with. 12,000 years of history against barely 90 years of prohibition. Less than 1% of the time this plant has been walking alongside us. For nearly all that time, it was simply part of life. You made rope with it in the morning and burned it at a funeral by nightfall. An entire people rebuilt their identity around it and greeted their neighbors with a single word. That meant, in the same breath, plant and life. And that man, buried with his harp and his last kilo of the plant, never knew anything about drug schedules or political strategies. He just knew the plant deserved to be kept, and the people who loved him made sure he'd never go without it. If this story left you thinking, or if it moved you to imagine those people caring for their own until the very end, hit like, subscribe for the next story, and tell me in the comments which part hit you the hardest. Thanks for sticking around. See you next time.